I can show you what I do. I actually learned this. Are you familiar with Dave Morrow?
Mm-mm.
He's a landscape photographer, and if you Google Dave Morrow, Marrow photography, you can sort of see how he does it. And I basically learned my approach, my workflow for editing in Photoshop from him. He has a very specific workflow, and that's kind of where I learned from, and then I sort of picked up some of my own stuff. But he teaches it on Photoshop, so I'm guessing probably a lot of other people have a similar workflow.
Yeah, I think the challenge with Affinity isn't even necessarily workflow. It's like I have my way of working from Photoshop. You have your way of working. So like I want to go in and I want to create something in Affinity that I used to do in Photoshop, but I don't know where the hell that tool is, or they called it something else.
Yeah.
Right? So,
yeah.
Like what was it? What did Steven ask the other day? He asked about how
He's layer masking as well. Yeah, layer masking in Affinity, I think, is almost identical to Photoshop. It's not that hard. And so I'll just go ahead then. Let me share my screen. And I want to make sure that when I'm sharing my screen and I'm talking that you're actually able to hear me. So,
yep.
And then I'll kind of go through it. So let's see. You might need to help me out. We'll see. Okay, so there's screen share. Okay, so I guess you guys see my screen now?
Yep, I see your browser. I see your email.
All right, so I'm going to open up this picture of Michael Kautz that I took when we were in Moab, Troy.
Oh, cool.
Okay, so I'm in Windows. So I guess whatever I do, if you use Mac, you'll have to figure out how to translate that because I know squat about Mac. So in Windows, I would just right-click on that and go to Open with an Affinity Photo.
Mm-hmm.
And that'll open that up. So this is a CR2, so it's a Canon RAW file. And whenever you open a Canon RAW file, and I assume probably any RAW file in Affinity Photo, you're going to notice there's some icons up here. And this third one is, can you guys see my mouse and everything?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's called the develop persona. So in Affinity, one of the things I think that confuses people a lot is they use this word persona, and all it really is a workspace. And this develop persona, you could just say it's the raw develop workspace is all it is. And whenever you open up a raw file, it's going to default to that. If you open up a JPEG, you'll have to go over and select that to sort of do what I'm showing you guys. Now, let's see, I'm going to move this right here. Okay, so now what this develop persona is it is the equivalent, as best I can understand, of Adobe Camera Raw. So like if you're in Adobe Photoshop and you go to Adobe Camera Raw, that's what this develop persona basically is.
Right.
So let's say this is where you would do, your basic adjustments to your raw file before you go in to this, what they call the photo persona. The photo persona is the one at the far left up here. That's more like your basic Photoshop screen. So I'm in develop persona. So let's say, what do I want to do? I'll click on my basic tab over here to the right. Let's say I want to raise the exposure just a tad, maybe. I want to pull some of these, or kind of pull some of these blacks. I could use black point and kind of draw out some of those shadows. Or if I want to draw out those shadows, I can go down here and click on shadows and highlights. And that'll bring up a couple of sliders. And so I can pull out some of Michael's shadows in his sweater and stuff there if I wanted to. Drop down the highlights a little bit, something like that, for instance. Now, or let's say, that's all I'm going to do in it for now. There's all kinds of stuff here. If you look, there's exposure, black point, brightness, contrast, clarity, saturation, vibrance. You can go here and fiddle with your white balance, I've already showed you shadows and highlights. So you can do all that. You can also go into this tab and you can make lens corrections. You can adjust the distortion. So let's just, for the heck of it, I'll just adjust that a little bit. Horizontal, vertical, rotation, scale. You can do all this stuff. You can work on your chromatic aberration, just basically all the stuff you would do in Adobe Camera Raw. Now I will tell you that, like, I can't remember how it was in Photoshop, but in Affinity Photo, if it's running a process, it won't let you touch anything else until that's done. All right, so you can go into the details tab. That's where you can adjust things like sharpness. So let's see, details. Detail refinement. So you can adjust sharpness and all of that. You can do noise reduction. There's sliders for that, colors, details, contribution. Anyway, and then there's, curves and black and white, split toning. There's all kinds of things you can do in this develop persona. So once you're done working in the develop persona, or the equivalent of Adobe Camera Raw, you just click develop. And then if you look up here, it's going to automatically switch you to the photo persona. And so, like I said, that's the equivalent of your main Photoshop window. So the way I learned to work, or I basically copied this off of Dave Morrow's method. And so what I would do here is I'll click, you can right click and click duplicate, or you can use Control J, which I think is in the same thing as Photoshop. So you highlight that, so I'm in the layers. If you notice, I'm in the layers tab. So here's all your layers work. So I'll just hit Control J, bam, it puts up a new layer. And let's say that in this layer, I want to darken the sky and work on saturation and that sort of stuff a little bit. So I'm just going to call it sky. All right. So now I'm highlighting sky. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to the develop persona. Okay. So now I'm back into the equivalent of Adobe Camera Raw. So let's see. I'm going to drop the exposure in that sky a little bit, and let's look at saturation. I want to increase the saturation a tad. So hopefully that works out good. Oh, there. So I'm not trying to do a perfect picture here, guys, just trying to give you an idea how this works. So I click saturation. Now you notice that saturates the whole picture. So I click develop. Now there's my whole picture. So now we get into layer masking. So what I want to do,
I'm sorry, that only applied to the layer you had selected, right?
Correct. So if I take that off, there's my original layer.
Oh, cool.
Okay. So now I've saturated the sky there, but it saturates everything else as well. So I click right here to add a layer mask. Boom. Now what I do, and this is, I don't know, there may be a better, like a quicker way to do this, but here's what I do. So I click on my layer mask and I click Control B for my brush, or if you look right here is your brush tool, you just click paintbrush tool, or Control B, which I think is the same as Photoshop. And right here, you can select whether you want a white brush or a black brush. So just like Adobe.
That's funny, because I spent forever looking for that damn color palette.
Yeah.
I kept looking for the standard Photoshop palette, and I didn't look for a tab. So
yeah, it's actually the tab. Yeah. So now I've got my brush here. You can see it, and you can use your bracket keys to increase the size, right? And up here, you can select the opacity and all of that stuff, and the hardness. I pretty much always keep my hardness to 0, but I've got a 100% opacity brush. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go over this whole photo, and I'm going to get rid of all my, or I'm going to basically hide the adjustments from this layer. Then I'm going to switch back over to the white, and I'm going to show only what I want to show, which is the sky. So I'll drop that a little bit, drop the size. Then you can go in and kind of brush back in your sky. I'm doing it kind of sloppy. I don't want to take a lot of time on it, but that sort of thing, right?
Hey, Thomas, I'm curious, when you created that layer mask in Photoshop, if you hold down, I think it's Command or Option, it creates an inverted layer mask. Have you tried to do that?
I haven't, but I think if you right click on this, yeah, I don't know how to do that layer.
Well, I'm just wondering, like, if you just create a new layer and then just hit like Command or Control and then that layer mask and see if it makes you an empty layer mask.
Okay, we'll do that. So yeah. I'll go back here to my black brush and I'll just kind of fine tune this a little bit.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So I know that's sloppy and I'm sorry, but that's, I don't want to take all week on this. All right. So there now only my sky's adjusted. So if I turn off this layer, there's the original, there's the sky. Now, let's say I want to work on some clarity. Well, maybe do some clarity work with all these, rock formations down in the canyon. So you could duplicate this, but you can also like right click on that layer and click merge visible, boom. And that'll give you basically I don't know if the right word is, but same as Photoshop, right? Merge like visible. Yeah. So, and then I'm just going to put clarity work.
Yeah, because I think the shortcut in Photoshop is like Shift Option Command E or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I've never been good at remembering all that stuff. I use very few keyboard shortcuts. I use it all the
time. That's the only reason I remember that.
Yeah. Okay, so for clarity work, so now I'm highlighting my clarity layer. I go back to my develop persona or camera raw, right?
Oh, okay.
And I look at this layer, I go down, there's a clarity slider. And let's just crank up the clarity a little bit for the hell of it, okay? So there you go. For what it's worth, there's your clarity. So now I'll go back to the develop persona. I'm sorry, I'll develop and go back to the photo persona.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
If you go back to the background layer or the sky layer, are the raw adjustments that you made in the develop persona there?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So those are basically like smart objects. You could always go back and change them.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And that's one of the things, I don't know if you saw it or not, but Frederick did that interview, and basically everything in Affinity is their equivalent of smart objects.
Got it.
Okay, so I'm going to create, now that I've added clarity to this, I'm going to create another layer mask. And you got to click on that mask, and this will become darker, and you're on it. And so let's see, you wanted to do the invert.
Yeah, if you just undo the mask, I'm just wondering if you like go back a couple steps.
So you want me to delete my mask?
Yeah.
Okay, there it is, deleted.
And then hold down the control key when you click on the mask option.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
See, when I do it, I use Affinity Photo on my iPad. And when I click add mask, it actually gives me the option when I click it to add a filled mask or an empty mask.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Good. Okay, so that's that's great.
I've seen something like that. I have seen something like that. I just don't use it, and so I don't know readily where it is. But yeah, so you got your mask there, and it looks like I don't think that worked. Okay, yeah, I don't think that did it work.
No, it did. Yeah, because see, it's black right now. So basically, all you have to do is paint in white wherever you want it to show up or to mask it out.
Well, see, this is my white brush here. If you look, this is my white brush, and it's actually blurring out my clarity work.
No, see, initially what you did is you made it white.
Oh, you're right. I'm sorry.
And then you flipped it when you did the first one. So however you work, it doesn't matter. But the same masking option works in Affinity as it does in Photoshop. So
okay, all right, yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's not really the way I do it, but I'll have to experiment with it to feel more comfortable with it, I think. But anyway, so here you highlight your mask, get rid of all my adjustments, which I get it is probably the slow way to do it.
No, it's fine. No, this is all about learning, right? We just learn the method. Everybody's method's different. It doesn't matter.
right? And then I switch brushes, and now I can bring out my clarity just in the rock formations, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just like so. You can do that work. Now, let's say, let me look for something to clone out here. So let's go to so that's basically my process is I go back and forth from Adobe Camera Raw, or in this case, back and forth from the develop persona and make my layers of adjustments. And, works pretty good for me at the moment. So I might even want to add some clarity in here just to make it look a little different.
And that's awesome that those effects are being applied off the raw file, because you keep going back to the develop persona. So you're maintaining that higher level of quality than what you might normally do in Photoshop, where it comes in as a TIFF or a JPEG, and then you apply Adobe Camera Raw as a filter.
Right.
So this is
exactly
nice. Okay.
All right. So let's say I want to get rid of something in here. We'll find something, but let me move my little screen over here a bit. So I will tell you this. I have done official experiments with this. Content-aware object replacement is, without a doubt, better than it is in Photoshop. I'm not saying everything in Affinity Photo is, but that is. And I don't know how they did it, but it smokes Photoshop. And I put up a video on TWiP Pro once that showed it, and it's just way better. So for that, you come down here and you got a couple of tools, the healing brush, patch tool, blemish removal. This in-painting brush tool is really nice. So what you do is you just click on it. You can use your bracket keys to increase your size. So let's say that for whatever reason, I wanted to get rid of this little stretch of brown right here for who knows what reason, right? Just for the hell of it, basically. So you just brush that right there. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot something.
You're on your layer mask, right?
Yeah, I'm on my layer mask. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and do another merge visible. And I'm just going to put in here in painting. Okay. So now I'm on the in painting layer. So I use my in painting tool right there. And I'll just go down to this little brown section here and just brush it like that. And boom, it is gone. And it does an extremely good job. In the video I put on TWiP earlier, I literally took the top off of a castle, and it created sky with clouds behind it almost perfectly. It was ridiculous how good it was.
Yeah.
So that's that tool. Cloning, it just has a basic clone brush tool like, anything else. One of the things you want to notice when you're using Affinity Photos, if you look down here in the bottom right, it always tells you what to do. Your instructions are right down here. So Alt click to select a source. So I don't know. Let's say I wanted to take Michael's ear.
Or the letters off his arm. How about that?
Yeah. Oh, there. Yeah, let's do that.
I started to say, I don't want to be rude, but there's a guy in your landscape photo there.
It's Mike. Yeah. It's okay.
Yeah, so let's say I'll alt click his arm there, right? And then you can go in with your clone tool and just, clone out the letters and whatnot and touch it up. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time touching it up, but you get the idea.
Works the same, yeah.
Just a basic cloning tool. It's got some other, I think this is probably the same on Photoshop, but, if you use your magnifier to pull something in, if you want to bring it back down to size, you can just double click your, it's called the view tool. Just double click it and it'll pull it back down to the proper size. I mean, those are.
I have a question about that clone stamp and the in painting. Does it do like Photoshop does, where you can, if you chose to, put an empty layer on there and say sample all the layers below it, so that when you're doing the cloning and stuff, you can do it on a new empty layer instead of like copy merging every time?
Right.
So I actually don't do that. But if you look up here, let's see what all it's got. Align source, right there, current layer. current layer and below, layers beneath.
Oh,
So
there
I'm
we go.
guessing that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it actually does a better job than Photoshop, because in Photoshop I notice, like, if I'm working on anything that has a weird texture in it or any kind of grain like in the sky, it tends to granularize if you do it on a layer, it creates like a watermark look, or it's weird, creates these weird artifacts.
Right.
Affinity doesn't seem to do that. So that was one of the big reasons that I started switching, because I would be editing a job and I would be like, oh, I need to fix this branch out of the sky, and I would do it in Photoshop and it looked like crap. I'd be like, okay, I'm going to try Affinity. And so, for speed, for what I was doing, it worked really good. So nice.
Yeah. Very cool. So up here you have all your obligatory automatic stuff: auto levels, auto contrast, auto colors, auto white balance. And frankly, I almost never, the only one of those I've ever used is auto white balance, just to see what happens. Sometimes when I was doing portraits for our church photography, I used that a little bit and it didn't do too bad. To kind of run you through a couple of other quick things, the crop tool is just pretty much the same as any other crop tool, right? You can pull your stuff in, do whatever you want. Then when you're done, just hit apply, bam, you've got that. This liquefy persona is interesting. I've not done a lot of work with it, but that is more of the bending crap and, giving him a nice little egg head, like so. He'll appreciate that if he ever watches this video. Giving him a proper size camera rather than this little puny thing. You can stretch it out there and give him a real Canon lens.
I like it. It's so perfect you're doing that to Michael.
I know. And then there's other functions here that I'm not necessarily real good at, but then you just click apply and it'll take care of that. Then another one that I haven't used, Troy, I don't know if your work requires it or not. Well, there's tone mapping. So if you want to if I click this, it's actually going to go into the self-calculating process. It'll take a lot of time, but that's basically for HDR stuff and that kind of stuff. You can load up multiple pictures and run HDR. Well, let's just do it. Let's see. So right now it's only got one image in it, but we'll have to wait on that. But then it'll give you all the various options over here that you can choose from, as well as adjustments over here in your panels that you can use to modify that tone mapping.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of that in Photoshop or Affinity, because I do all that in Capture One. The only thing I'm doing in Affinity is pushing pixels, like, cleaning skies, cloning out branches, fixing things like that.
That's the same way I use Photoshop, because the thing that gets me is, because I do a lot of editing on my iPad with Affinity, but for raw processing, I don't think I could ever use that regularly, because I'm editing like 500 or more pictures at a time.
Right.
And as far as I can tell, you can only do one at a time in Affinity, right?
No, it does have a batch processing sort of thing. And the way, I'll show you how you do that here in a second. But so anyway, for tone mapping, you can pick your tone mapped image that you like as a starting point. Let's say you like that one as a starting point. Then you could come over here and fiddle with tonal compression or local contrast. You do whatever adjustments you want and then click apply. I'm just going to cancel out of it. Hey, before I go into the batch processing stuff, one of the things that I did find, fortunately, I'm not a portrait photographer, and I don't think I'm going to have a lot of need for this. But when I was doing the church portraits, Photoshop provided a cloning function that I cannot find. I don't think Affinity has it. And that is, like, let's say, Troy, I took a picture of you and there was glare in your glasses. Well, I could have taken two pictures, one without your glasses and one with your glasses. And then I can clone from, let's see, how did I do that? Well, Yeah, actually I could do that. I could clone from one image, one layer. I could put my cloning point on one layer and then make adjustments to another layer. But one of the things that I had to do was, when you're cloning with Photoshop, it allows you the ability to invert your clone point 180 degrees. So like I could clone from your left eye onto your right eye and actually make it work. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's not in Affinity that I know of. So your clone stuff that you can do in Affinity is very, very basic. So moving on to Joshua's question, if you want to, if you want to do batch processing work of any sort, Affinity does have that. And I don't have a batch of images really to explain this overly well, but what you can do is, let's see, add a batch job. I'm trying to remember. Troy, I told you the other day we were talking about creating the macros.
Yeah, and it just runs the exact same settings on all the images in the batch.
So it doesn't have like the film strip like in Capture One or in Lightroom.
No.
Yeah, it does. Let me pull out of this. Let me pull out of this picture.
See,
I don't know if
from what I'm understanding, like Ed doing it up from what they say, everything that you can, or at least almost everything you can do in the desktop version, you can do in the iPad version. But just from what I'm seeing on here is a lot of it's in different spots. Like the actual buttons are in different spots.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. So let's say I wanted to do a batch of images. Let me just find something here real quick. Open. How do I do that? New batch job. Add images. Still image work. Troy. Where's my little file on that? Moab with Troy. So let's just say I wanted to batch process some of these. You can open them up. Where is it? Okay, so there's my little list of stuff. And I can do basic adjustments like resave them all as TIFFs or pings or however you say that, or JPEGs. I could do that. I could adjust where I save them to. I can, if you look here, it says available macros, and I don't have any created, but if you create macros, you'll be able to pick to run that macro as well. And
so
that's,
those are like, I'm sorry, those are like, so macros are like actions?
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. So let's actually, let me try to remember how I did this. Let me just open up my other image real quick. Or a different image. So before we go into macros, one thing that's worth looking at, there is let me just go back to develop. I'm not going to do any raw file developing. If you look right here, there's a history panel, and everything you do is saved in that. And so at any time, so let's say I do a saturation adjustment. I go to merge that in. Then I do, let's see, what else do I want to do? Just for kicks and grins, I'll say I do a contrast adjustment. All right, so let's say I do that stuff. To back step out of that, if you don't want it, you just go to your history panel and back out of it, right? You can revert to any part in your history. Now, if you want to save your file and you don't want to lose that stuff, you can go to File and Save History with Document. And that way, when you save this as an Affinity file and you open it back up, you'll still have your history, which I do, right? You know, it has this prompt that comes up and says, if you do this, somebody else will be able to see exactly what you did, to which I reply, yeah, who cares? Let's see.
It's like a PSD or a TIFF with layers.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you remember how to get to that macro
It's like a view tab because it pops up on the left.
Oh yeah, view. Yeah, you're right. View macros. Cannot
But it's
remind.
still not it's not a workflow like what we get in Capture One or Lightroom. It's it literally creates a quick shortcut, and it back processes a number of jobs without having to touch each image.
Exactly. So it's under View, Studio, and Macros. And if you click that, it'll pull up this little dialog. And basically, you just hit the record button and start recording your macro, and everything that you do is going to be added to it. So let's see if I did I'll adjust my contrast back down, pull the brightness up, merge, then do, let's say we convert it to a black and white, merge that. All right, so basically then you just stop your macro, right? And right here, there's a export. You can add it to a library. You can export it to a standalone file. And then when you open up that batch job, you can just run that macro on it. But that's, as best I can understand, that's the closest thing that you have to
I wonder
batch.
if those macros can be saved and run from the iPad.
Yeah, that I don't know.
I know that you can make macros on the iPad version. I don't know where it puts them or where they go, but I guess you'd be limited to how much space is on the iPad. But I know, like, sometimes when I do I know this is a different thing, but when I do a lookup table adjustment, I can store my lookup tables out in the cloud and then open them from the cloud, just like you can open a photo from the cloud in Affinity.
Mm-hmm.
So I can do it that. So I wonder if I store the macro file on the cloud somewhere, if it would give me the option to run it from the cloud.
That would be interesting.
Yeah. I don't know. I do not have an iPad. So I can't answer that. But, there's one other persona, quote unquote persona or workspace, and that's the export persona. And I actually don't use this much. And the reason why is because all the exports I do, I just go to File, Export, and you can choose all your options and just do it that way. But if you're doing like one of those, if you're doing work where you need to crop out several different pieces of an image to use for different things, that's where you would go to this export persona, and it gives you all the tools to do that sort of thing. So not really in my not really in my wheelhouse. But I think the biggest thing that people need to know to use Affinity is their use of the term personas, right? All it really means is workspace. And if people can make the mental jump from that, you just got different workspaces. Most of the stuff that you can do from the develop persona is stuff that you can do from the photo persona under the adjustments tab, the vast majority of it. So you could do almost all your work from the photo persona, but I just do this thing like Dave Morrow does and back and forth from the develop persona. It just feels good to me.
So curiosity, in the photo persona, are your selection tools are in there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, yep. All my tools are right there.
I'm sorry. On the iPad, it's a separate persona.
Okay.
There's a selection persona, and all your selection tools are in there.
You're talking about these tools?
Yeah, like you know, like your quick select, I don't know if they call it the magic wand in Affinity, but that they have that in there too. But
yeah, that's all here.
On the iPad version, there's a separate persona for that. So if you're selecting things, you would have to switch to that persona.
Yeah, no, not on the desktop version. On the desktop version, it's all in this photo persona. So like your quick select tool that you're talking about, if you, right here's your selection brush, there's a flood select, but like this tool's actually this selection brush. You just click it. You can click add or subtract up here. And so use your bracket keys to get what you want. And you can just basically go around. If you want it to snap to edges, you can select that. It'll do a little bit better job of snapping to the edges.
Oh, wow.
As you go around, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
and then,
see, this is what I'm talking about here. So like, I don't know if y'all can see it how well, but you got your regular photo persona up here, and then there's a selection one. And I tap it. See, there's where all my selection tools come up.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And so like here, I overshot my edges. So you can just go up here and click subtract and go in there and sort of refine everything a little bit. And, you know, you can keep refining and refining. And I'll be honest, even in like Photoshop, I always had a hard time with really fine-tuned selections, but I typically don't use that all that much. And then if you want to get out of that, I think you can just do, well, I guess you just switch tools maybe. No, maybe not. Edit.
You need to deselect it. Yeah.
So just like
Photoshop, it's Command or Control D.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. Same. They definitely have a lot of similarities with Photoshop on those keyboard shortcuts.
Right. Yeah, I remember the interview that Frederick did. The guy was like, you know, it's the obvious commands, right? You want to deselect, it's D. You want to crop, it's C. Stuff like that.
Oh, there it is. There's a select. I forgot this. There's a select menu there where you can do deselect, and it has all those shortcuts, just like every other piece of software. So,
Cool.
What other? I'm trying to think of what else I can share with you guys that I use. Oh, so this is really good. So there's your dodge, your burn, and your sponge. So, you know, dodge and burn are the obvious things. The sponge, if you've never used it before, is saturation. You just saturate stuff with your brush. It's got right here is your blur, sharpen, smudge, all of that.
How does the dodge and burn work? Because in Photoshop, it really muddies the color. Really.
Yeah. It's probably not much different here. Let's see here. I think I turned that black and white. Okay, so if you go to where is it, right here? So like if you burn, you can set your brush. I usually do it in small increments, so I'll set my opacity down to I usually set it down to about 25 and then figure out what's going to work. And then you can just sort of, every time you hit it, it's kind of like Photoshop. Let's say we're going to dull this. Every time you go over something, it's got kind of an additive effect.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. I got to get out of this. All right.
So what should the hardness be, Thomas?
The what?
The hardness. Hardness is at 0. Should it be?
Yeah, I keep my hardness. I keep my hardness at 0 so it doesn't make really strong edges.
Okay, got it.
I don't know why that's actually not working though.
Because you're on a HSL shift adjustment layer.
Okay.
So I think you have to pick the pixel.
There you go. All right. Yeah. So then that was all the way up 61.
Yeah.
You can kind of dodge it back down. Yeah. It doesn't, like if you dodge and burn, it doesn't, I don't know. I don't think it messes the colors up too much.
No, it's not bad.
Yeah,
no.
Not bad. Looks good.
No, in Photoshop, I use black or white, and I use soft light to dodge and burn without ruining the saturation and the tone.
Yeah, I could never get it right.
And you can set your tonal ranges here, right? Shadows, midtones, highlights. I'm not sure. You know, those
are brush dynamics. Yeah,
brush dynamics. And then the sponge tool is same as I think Photoshop has that too, right? Where you can just kind of touch up saturation in various areas, however much you want. Still have all your typical adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
So, Thomas, do you use this every day now instead of instead of Photoshop?
Yeah, I don't have Photoshop on my computer anymore. I've started using Capture One.
Yeah.
The image that I put in the last photo critique is the first image that I've ever edited top to bottom with Capture One. So I'm kind of starting to learn my way around that.
Nice.
And so I'm using Capture One and Affinity. That's all I've got Luminar, but I don't really like Luminar. But nothing personal with Luminar. It just doesn't feel right to me. So yeah, basically it's Capture One and Affinity at this point.
Yeah. Well, I'm just amazed at stuff in Capture One. Boy, those tools are fantastic. Troy's showing me some stuff. Wow.
Yeah.
The shadow recovery is insane how good it is. It's unbelievable.
Well, I will tell you that image that I put in the photo critique last week of the dog jumping up and grabbing the Frisbee.
Yeah.
I edited that first in Affinity. Then I decided to try Capture One. I could not get as good a photo in Affinity or as good a finished product in Affinity as I did in Capture One. And I'm brand new at Capture One, and I still couldn't get as good with Affinity, which I have a lot more experience with.
Yeah. It's just amazing how it treats the pixels. The pixels, it just knows. The AI is just spectacular. It's unbelievable. Yeah. It's unbelievable. It's really good. Okay. Very cool. Okay. More stuff to learn.
Cool. Well, thanks, Thomas. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, that was good. Sorry I came in late. Sorry about that.
Oh my, that's all right. If you go now, have you used Affinity much, Peter?
No, never. This is the first time I've seen it.
Yeah, so Troy's recording this. So if you go back, you'll see how to do layer masks and all that. And it's all basically
nice.
Almost exactly the same as Photoshop.